The drive up the mountain had been peaceful at first, winding roads framed by towering pines and patches of untouched snow. It was the kind of landscape you see on postcards so still, it almost didn't feel real. I kept glancing at the GPS, watching the little blue dot crawl toward a location that didn't seem to exist on any traditional map. Cell signal had dropped an hour ago, and the last gas station I passed looked like it hadn't been open since the late 80s. I should have felt nervous, but instead, there was a strange calm that settled over me, like I was slipping out of one world and into another. The road narrowed the higher I climbed, the snow piled heavier on the sides, and then, just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, I saw it. The Carrington Hotel rose through the mist like something carved from a dream, or maybe a memory too old to belong to me. Its tall white exterior had yellowed slightly with age, but that only made it look more dignified, like it wore its history with pride. Dozens of windows lined the facade, all dark, all watching. A series of balconies wrapped around the second and third floors, and a tower at the top stood like a crown. A wide circular drive led up to the grand entrance, flanked by twin stone lions whose faces had eroded into permanent snarls. I parked and stepped out, the cold biting through my coat instantly. There was no one else in sight. No guests, no valet, just silence and the crunch of my boots on the frozen gravel. The front doors were old oak, heavy and ornate, and creaked when I pushed them open. Inside, warmth rushed over me, but it wasn't the comforting kind. It was stale, recycled, as though the building had been holding its breath and exhaled only when I entered. The lobby stretched out wide, filled with antique furniture, faded rugs, and chandeliers coated in dust. The ceiling was high and arched, with intricate molding that had long since cracked in places. A fireplace roared in one corner, though no one seemed to be tending it. The air smelled faintly of wax, wood polish, and something older, something like mildew or forgotten time. At the front desk stood a man who could have walked straight out of an old movie. His uniform was perfectly pressed, dark navy with brass buttons, and a name tag that simply read Mr. Harlan. His hair was slicked back with precision, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile when I approached, nor did he greet me the way most hotel clerks do. Instead, he simply handed me a key-an, actual brass key with a large, worn tag that read 407, and gestured toward the elevator with a slow nod. I asked if there were other guests, but he said nothing, just that same blank look, as if my voice hadn't fully reached him. The elevator sat at the far end of the lobby, its doors framed in tarnished gold. It groaned when I pressed the button, the light above flickering as it arrived. Stepping inside felt like stepping into a coffin lined with velvet. The buttons were cracked and uneven, the light above them dim. I pressed 4 and waited as the elevator lurched to life, its cables whining as it climbed. No music played, no sound except for the mechanical moan of something very old struggling to move. When the doors finally opened, the hallway ahead stretched long and narrow, wallpaper peeling, sconces casting dim light in pools that barely reached the carpet. The number 407 was at the very end. I walked toward it, each step muffled, yet loud in the quiet. The hallway felt longer than it looked, stretching in that strange way old places sometimes do, where perspective seems to shift subtly as you move. Every few steps, I passed another door, each identical, each with a tarnished brass number screwed just above the peephole. The carpet beneath my feet was worn, patterned with burgundy and gold that had faded unevenly over the years. and each footstep released a faint, musty scent that reminded me of attics and forgotten trunks. There were no sounds, no voices, no televisions, not even the creak of movement behind any of those closed doors. Just silence that settled over everything like a thick woolen blanket. When I reached room 407, I paused without meaning to. The door looked no different than the others, yet something about it felt heavier, as if it knew I was coming. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the key. It slid into the lock more smoothly than I expected, and with a soft click, the door opened inward with the gentlest push. The first thing that hit me was the smell, clean, but not fresh. It was the scent of aged wood, old linens, and something metallic underneath it all. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a twilight glow, and as I stepped inside, the air felt still, untouched. The room was larger than I thought it would be, with a high ceiling and thick crown molding that framed the space in a quiet elegance. A heavy four-poster bed stood against the far wall, its dark wood gleaming faintly, the comforter tucked in with military precision. To the left, an armoire stood slightly ajar, revealing just a sliver of shadow within. A plush chair sat near the window, and beside it, a small round table held a half-full glass of water and a book with no title on the cover. The lamp on the nightstand flickered once when I turned it on, casting a yellowish hue that didn't quite reach the corners of the room. The mirror above the dresser was fogged, as if someone had recently taken a hot shower, though the bathroom door was open and no steam lingered there. I approached it slowly, instinctively raising a hand to the glass. When my fingers touched it, it was warm, naturally warm, as if someone had just stood there breathing on it moments ago. My reflection looked back at me, but something about it felt delayed, a millisecond too slow. I blinked, and the moment passed, chalked it up to exhaustion or the weird lighting, and turned away. The television was the old box kind, with dials instead of buttons, sitting on a wooden stand that didn't quite match the rest of the furniture. The remote was nowhere. In sight, I sat on the edge of the bed and bounced slightly, the mattress firm, barely giving under my weight. The bedspread was stiff, and the sheets beneath smelled faintly of lavender and something older, something hard to name. I reached for the glass of water, hesitated, then picked it up. The rim was wet, fresh, as though someone had just set it down before I arrived. My suitcase sat unopened by the door, but I suddenly didn't feel like unpacking. Instead, I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. The view outside was swallowed in fog. I could make out the tops of snow-covered trees in the distance, and just a faint outline of the curved driveway below. No people, no movement. The glass felt cold under my fingertips, but I couldn't tell if it was from the outside or the inside. The silence in the room was growing heavier by the second, like a presence building itself out of the stillness. I turned back toward the door, thinking I might go explore the rest of the hotel or find the dining area. That's when I noticed the chair by the window had turned slightly, angled just enough to face the bed. I didn't remember it being that way when I entered. A subtle shift, but it made my chest tighten. I stared at it for a long moment, then glanced around the room, half expecting something to be standing behind me in the mirror. I sat on the edge of the bed longer than I intended, the silence inside the room pressing in until it almost felt like sound itself, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but watchful. I reached for the lamp and turned it off, then on again, testing it. It buzzed faintly with each flick, like it didn't want to be touched. I lay back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling where shadows collected in the corners. The longer I stared, the more it seemed like the shadows were moving in sudden, obvious shifts, but in that slow, imperceptible way that makes you question if they were ever still to begin with. I checked my phone. No signal, no Wi-Fi, just a blank screen and the blinking reminder that I was alone and unreachable. I set it on the nightstand and looked around again. The room felt slightly different. The curtains no longer looked fully drawn, and the corner where the chair sat seemed darker than before. It was as if the light itself was slowly being drained out of the space, dimming by degrees too small to notice until it was too late. That's when the phone rang. The sound cut through the room like a blade. The old rotary phone on the nightstand, something I'd only half noticed earlier, was suddenly shrieking with a tinny, high-pitched ring that seemed too loud for such a small room. I jolted upright, my pulse jumping in my throat. The phone kept ringing, each chime more aggressive than the last. I stared at it, unsure whether to answer, but it didn't stop, and the sound was unbearable in the silence, so I reached out and picked up the receiver. At first, there was nothing, no voice, no static, just an absence, a void. I said hello softly, but my voice didn't sound right, too small, too uncertain. I pressed the receiver tighter to my ear, straining to hear something, anything. Then came the hum, not quite static, not quite silence, but a low, vibrating hum, like something mechanical buried deep underground. It pulsed in my ear, and I felt it more than heard it, like it was reverberating through my chest. Then a whisper, faint, almost drowned by the hum, but unmistakable. Don't leave. Just 2 words, spoken with breath that felt far too close. My eyes darted around the room as I held the receiver, my breath shallow. The voice hadn't come from across a wire, it felt like it came from within the receiver, like something was pressing its mouth right against it, speaking directly into my ear. There was no inflection, no urgency, just calm, eerie certainty. The hum grew louder for a second, then stopped altogether. The line went dead. I pulled the receiver away from my ear and stared at it, half expecting to see condensation or blood, or something worse. But it looked normal, just a dusty, outdated phone with nothing left to say. I set it back into the cradle with a shaky hand, every instinct in my body now telling me something was very wrong. The temperature in the room had dropped. I could feel it in my bones, a sudden chill that made my breath visible. Then came the creaking dot. It started above me, a long, drawn-out groan, like weight shifting across old floorboards. But I was on the top floor. There should have been nothing above me but the roof. I stared at the ceiling, the sound continuing in slow, deliberate steps, back and forth just above my bed, moving with the rhythm of someone pacing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. When the creaking stopped, the silence that followed felt even heavier than before. And then, almost gently, the phone rang again. The second time the phone rang, I didn't move. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was something colder, something deeper. A kind of paralysis that started in the spine and worked its way outward. I stared at the rotary phone, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It just kept ringing with that same shrill, jarring cry. Each chime scraped at my nerves until I couldn't bear it anymore. With trembling fingers, I reached out and picked up the receiver again. This time, there was no hum, just breathing, shallow, uneven, directly in my ear. I didn't speak. Neither did the voice on the other end, but I could feel the presence through the phone line, like something was watching me from the other side, waiting for me to say something it could respond to. I slowly lowered the receiver back into its cradle without a word. The moment it touched the base, the lamp beside me flickered once, twice, then went dark. The room plunged into shadows, only the faint light from the hallway beneath the door offering any visibility. I stood up and walked slowly to the switch on the wall, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. The power was gone, or something had taken it. I moved to the window and drew back the curtains, hoping for some light from outside, but the fog had thickened. I couldn't even see the ground anymore, just swirling grey that moved like it had a mind of its own. I backed away from the window and turned toward the bed. And that's when I noticed the glass of water on the table was empty. I hadn't touched it. I was certain I hadn't. But the glass was bone dry, with the faintest trace of condensation on the inside. Like someone or something had just finished drinking it. My mouth went dry, the air growing heavier with each breath. The silence was louder now, dense and full, like sound was being held just outside the room's walls. The floor beneath me creaked, but I hadn't moved. I looked down, and it creaked again, this time 2 steps to my left. I turned slowly. Nothing there, but I could feel it, something shifting in the room with me. A pressure, a change in the air that made my skin crawl. I reached into my coat pocket for my phone, hoping for even the weakest signal, but the screen refused to light up, dead. I pressed the button again and again, but nothing happened. A soft knock echoed through the room, not at the door. At the wall. It came from the wall opposite the bed, where the headboard was mounted. Just one knock at first, then another, then 3 in a row. Not random, a rhythm, like someone trying to signal from the other side. I pressed my ear gently against the wall, and for a moment I thought I heard something, a whisper, maybe, or the sound of movement, but it faded too fast to catch. I stepped back, heart pounding, and noticed something new. The mirror over the dresser was no longer fogged. It was clear, but what it showed wasn't right. The room reflected in the mirror looked the same, but the lighting was different, dimmer. The chair near the window had moved closer to the bed, and there was a figure sitting in it. I turned around instantly, but the chair was empty. In the mirror, the figure remained unmoving, staring straight at the bed. I watched it for a long time, trying to make out the face, but it was blurred, like the features refused to come into focus. I stepped closer to the mirror. My own reflection was still there, but behind me, that figure loomed larger now, standing slowly as if rising from the chair. I turned quickly again. Nothing. But when I looked back into the mirror, it was closer, so close it was nearly touching my shoulder. I staggered away from the mirror, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. My hands trembled as I reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The knob turned halfway, then stopped, stuck as if welded shut from the other side. I rattled it harder, yanked with both hands, but it didn't budge. Panic was rising now, not just fear, but desperation. I was trapped. I turned back toward the room, searching for anything, a phone, a window latch, some kind of escape, but everything felt distant, dreamlike, as if the rules of space had started to bend. The air was thick, almost humid now, filled with the scent of old dust and something more pungent beneath it, like rusted iron or rot. I rushed to the window again, throwing the curtains open wide, but all I could see was fog dense, endless, pulsing like a living thing. There was no parking lot, no trees, no ground at all. just that white abyss pressing against the glass, and in the distance, the faint impression of movement, shapes, figures, maybe, drifting slowly through the mist. I pressed my face to the cold window, straining to see, but the fog seemed to draw. Closer the harder I looked, creeping up the glass like breath. I stepped back as the window began to fog from the outside, smearing inward in circular patterns, as if someone was slowly tracing the glass with their fingers. I turned away, pulse thudding in my throat, and that's when I noticed something else had changed. The room was no longer how I'd left it. The chair was now at the center of the room, facing the bed directly, and something was on the bed, not sitting, lying, covered by the blanket as if peacefully sleeping. My mouth went dry. I hadn't seen it happen. I hadn't heard anything move, but the sight of that lump beneath the covers sent a cold shiver through my spine. I took a cautious step forward, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop. The form didn't move. It didn't breathe. I got close enough to see that the edge of the blanket had been tucked around it carefully, deliberately. There was something reverent about the way it lay there, like someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it looked peaceful. I reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the edge of the blanket, and just before I lifted it, the bed shifted, just slightly, like weight had moved. I backed away, heart hammering, and the lights in the room flickered violently. The lamp sparked once, then went dark again. The walls groaned like they were being pressed from the outside. I stumbled toward the door again, trying the knob, but it was still jammed. I pounded against it with my fist, shouting for help, for anyone. No sound came back. The hallway was as dead as the room. My fists left no echo. The air grew colder, and with it came a sound, a low, dragging whisper that seemed to come from under the floorboards. It moved slowly, circling the room like something was crawling beneath me, tracing my every step. Then it stopped. A single knock rang out this time from inside the closet. I turned slowly, eyes fixed on the armoire. The door was slightly open now, just wide enough to see darkness inside. The kind of darkness that feels deeper than absence, the kind that swallows light. I stared for a long moment, breath held, waiting. Then the door creaked open another inch. I didn't see a hand, a face, or any defined shape, but I felt it. The presence, heavy and cold, watching me from within that narrow opening. It didn't want to reveal itself, not yet. It wanted me to look, to come closer, to acknowledge it, and that realization hit me like a wave. The hotel wasn't trying to scare me away. It was waiting for me to become part of it, to accept what was happening, to surrender to it willingly. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I curled up on the floor with my back pressed against the door, staring at the closet across the room, waiting for it to open fully. It never did. It just remained ajar, like an eye half-lidded, always. Watching, every time I blinked, it seemed to shift slightly, like something inside it moved only when I wasn't looking. Hours passed that way, maybe more. I couldn't tell. My phone was still dead, my watch had stopped ticking, and the outside world had become a blank wall of fog. Time inside that room had collapsed. There was only the growing sense that the hotel had wrapped itself around me, like it had been closing a fist and was nearly finished making a fist. When the morning light finally came, more something like it wasn't like sunrise. It was dim, grey, the kind of pale light that seeps in during a snowstorm. It illuminated the room just enough to show me the outlines of the furniture, the closed bathroom door, the mirror above the dresser, and the closet that still hadn't shut. I stood up slowly, legs sore, joints stiff, and moved toward the bed. The shape that had been beneath the covers was gone. The blanket had been turned down neatly, as if no one had ever lain there. But I remembered the pressure, the weight, the outline of a body. It hadn't been a dream. None of it had been a dream. I went to the mirror and looked into it cautiously, half expecting to see something behind me again. But there was only me. My face looked pale, drained, eyes rimmed with shadows, as though I had aged in a matter of hours. I leaned in closer and whispered my own name, just to hear something familiar. My reflection mouthed the word in perfect sync. I stared at myself for a long time, almost hypnotized by the stillness, until I noticed something strange in the background of the mirror. The chair had moved again. In the reflection, it was positioned right behind me. I turned quickly. The chair in the room hadn't moved, but in the mirror it had. That's when I realized something wasn't right with the reflection at all. The room in the glass was just slightly off, darker, emptier, and the version of me inside it wasn't matching my movements anymore. I backed away slowly, refusing to take my eyes off the mirror, then turned toward the door again. This time, the knob turned, the latch clicked, the door creaked open as if it had never been locked. The hallway outside was lit by flickering overhead lights. I stepped out, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the worn carpet. The corridor felt longer, stretched, in a way that made me dizzy. The walls looked different. Two faded portraits that hadn't been there before now lined the walls, each face blurred or smudged beyond recognition. I passed one that looked almost familiar, paused to study it, and realized with a jolt it looked like me, but not quite. Something was wrong with the proportions, the expression, the eyes. I kept walking, turning corners that didn't lead where they should, climbing stairs that looped back to the same floor. I found the elevator and pressed the button. It didn't light up. I pressed it again, harder, and the metal doors finally slid open with a groan. Inside, the same dusty brass walls and cracked mirror awaited. I stepped in, hesitated, then pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed and the elevator began to descend, but the numbers above the door didn't change. They flickered, reversed, blinked out. The walls seemed to press in closer. I felt the pressure in my ears, like the elevator was sinking below the building, down into something deeper than a basement. When the doors finally opened, I wasn't in the lobby. I wasn't sure where I was. The hall was narrow, the walls lined with candlelight, though there was no flame. The floor beneath me was stone. The air smelled like earth and wet wood. I walked slowly, drawn forward more than deciding to move. Ahead, I heard voices faint, overlapping whispers, like a crowd murmuring behind a thin wall. I turned a corner and saw another door, older than the rest, cracked open, light spilling through. I approached it, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob, but before I touched it, I heard something behind me. Not footsteps, breathing, slow, steady, right at my neck. I turned, but there was nothing there. Only the corridor, empty and dim, and the echo of that breath still warming the air. When I looked forward again, the door was fully open. The room beyond was lit with a soft, golden glow, and inside were things that shouldn't exist: photos of people I knew who had never been to this place, objects from my childhood sitting on a shelf, even the music box my grandmother had given me, long since lost. I stepped through the doorway, heart racing, and the door slammed shut behind me.